Hi.
How you doing?
Oh my gosh, good.
How's your dog?
So far so good. I only gave her a couple of tablespoons of yogurt this morning until after our talk, so that if she's going to start vomiting, I can be there to clean it up. But it's interesting that I wanted her to be able to sleep on the bed like she normally does instead of put her in a crate, which would have been easier for me. And I thought, as long as she stays quiet, she's not going to vomit, because it seems to be like as soon as she does a dramatic move, that's what initiates the nauseousness. So anyway, so she's completely quiet, relaxed, and then Dakota is my other dog is starting to respond to all the wind noises and things banging on the roof, and so he's jumpy, and then she's jumpy. I'm like, oh my gosh, I guess they both have to go in their crates, and so every hour and a half, trying to figure out who is licking their lips,
Mhm.
and it was him. So I thought that was the preview of the thing to come, but she was fine. And gosh, my other Australian Terrier, just shy of 12, which is what Lil is, he was great until the last 48 hours of his life. And then, he went rapidly downhill and ended up having, a tumor that bled out, and that was it, which isn't the worst way to go, happy till the last 48 hours. But it's hard for me not to go there with her thinking, is this that kind of thing again? But
Right.
yeah, so
Yeah, and
worry.
well, it's so easy. I mean, vomiting is such a normal process, but it can represent such significantly bad things. Poisoning, you ate something that is going to destroy your insides, all kinds of things that there's no way around treating it seriously and worrying and watching,
Yeah.
even though most of the time it's fine.
Yeah. So, I have a question about that. So I assume when it starts as yellow, that's bile coming from, is that correct?
Yeah.
So what's the white foam stuff that happens, this would happen the last 4 of the 6 vomits?
So that's just saliva and gastric acids foaming. There's enough there's enough fatty material that makes bubbles in the chyme, in the mixture that's getting all churned up in the stomach, that there's always some foam in there. And when you vomit it up, you just get more, but you're also getting a lot of saliva, which foams pretty easily.
Which I guess explains the licking that happens right before the vomit.
Yeah, well, and you think about, I don't know about when you vomit, but when I vomit, not my favorite pastime, but having had food poisoning not that long ago, it's kind of funny because, you hear the same sounds your dog makes, only now it's you, and there's the yellow bile and there's the foam, and there's the part of me that's like, oh, that's really interesting. Oh, I don't want to see that. It makes me sick. But that's kind of interesting. And you're torn between the fascination and the just put a bullet in my head and I can be over with this.
Yeah.
And well, I wonder that discomfort we get, like from food poisoning, your whole body is just racked with it. And dogs don't show pain as much. And you wonder how much discomfort is systemic and they are just not showing it versus, oh, it's not that big a deal, and I just vomit up and life goes on.
Right. Well, it's interesting with Lil is yesterday, what was making me less worried is she had her normal sparkle. Like she has a sparkle in her eyes that exudes happiness. I can just see it. And this morning it was a little bit faded. And then after I fed her the yogurt, it was definitely faded. And she didn't even lick the bowl clean. I just, so I'm like, okay, she's not feeling great. And she may be feeling pretty crappy for her to not be sparkling like she usually does.
And the sparkling is an interesting thing because you can look at a dog's eyes, you can look at a person's eyes, and you can tell a lot by that sparkle, but I can't biologically come up with what that is, but we all pick up on it. And so then I wonder, is it our brain superimposing some imagery based on all the other cues it's getting based on eyes and nose and mouth and lips? And you know better than most people I talk to how little of vision is what's out there and how much of it is what's up here. Does the brain layer that on top? There would be some survival advantage to our pasting those kind of imagery on things, right? Then I start to wonder, well, is there a sparkle? Is the brain just saying, oh, the whole composition is better and we'll note it this way, right? And it's because you pretty much have to have like objective photographs that you didn't know the setting, and then look, could another person see sparkle versus not sparkle?
Yeah.
Oh, that's I could do that experiment.
Yeah, well, and, the interesting thing with Lil and her sparkle is that because we do such advanced training, I've done a bunch of trick training, really advanced freestyle tricks and, agility and all of that. And heading towards the ring or leaving the ring, she is prancing with such pride, and her eyes are they just look all sparkly. She's got a grin on her mouth, and she's just like rocking her stuff there. And so that, I think, is what I'm seeing in her, even when she's still, is I'm seeing that similarity in overall facial expression and maybe even posture without, getting, conscious about that she's. Yeah, no, I think it's more the facial expression, because her posture this morning, now that I think about it, was not good. It was a little bit not this,
More that
something was a
hang
little bit
to
different.
it.
Yeah. Yeah. So one more topic on regarding vomiting, since and
Always the
all my
best
notes
topic.
about your book, and we could go in so many different directions. So instead of following my notes and doing it in a linear way, I just like the fact that we just started here will lead us to, I know where we're going to get to, which is the thing that fascinates me the most. Is, well, we'll get there soon enough. So, okay. Before I was a dog person, I had this pet Yorkie that my ex-husband loved small dogs. So we had this Yorkie that ended up having seizures. And I believe is it before the seizure or after the seizure? It was probably right after the seizure that he would vomit. So what's the relationship between seizures and vomiting?
I can't do the biology there because I don't know, but I do know that it's common. In fact, my first experience I have a niece who's epileptic, who has seizures. Let's use the right word. She has a seizure disorder, and is an adult now. But my brother and his wife were visiting at our house, and in the middle, I picked up my niece, and was just an infant, right? And she all of a sudden just threw up all over me, just projectile vomiting all over me. And later that evening, she was vomiting some more. They took her to the emergency room, and it turned out it was her first seizure, and she's had, many through her life, and vomiting is a common part of that. I don't actually know the connection, although, almost anything is possible, because a seizure leads to disorganization in the brain, which includes motor function. And so I suppose it would probably be something on the order of sending signals to the stomach, reverse peristalsis, send everything out. But I'm guessing there.
Okay.
That's it. Certainly they correlate with each other, and there's a causal relationship between the seizure and vomiting, but I don't know what it is, if it's just like another muscle spasm, or if it's actual some defense mechanism to eject things from the body.
Yeah. Well, related to a future topic, one of the interesting things about this Yorkie is he liked to sleep on the pillow right above my head, which was a lovely thing, except when he had a seizure. And I guess my sleeping brain thought it was important enough to listen for the licking of the lips, and it gave me just a few seconds to grab the dog and either get him, to throw up over the side of the bed, or sometimes I could even rush to the bathroom, get him to throw up in the toilet. I mean, this was such a common occurrence that that my brain decided that's important. Listen for that.
Well, and we know when you're sleeping, lots of your brain is still active. In fact, your brain is more active sleeping than when you're not sleeping. Or parts of your brain are more active sleeping than when you're not sleeping. So the listening is going on, which is why noises, an infant crying wakes up a mother right away. They train quickly to be always listening to those important sounds, even while you're sleeping. So it would not take much for your brain to go, licking precedes vomit, precedes seizure, precedes vomiting. This is the earliest we catch the train. You better get going.
Yeah. Oh, goodness. And then I didn't catch it every time. And then it became a big mess of clean up the vomit that always seemed to ooze down the back of the bed under the mattress. And it's like, ugh.
Yeah, and I don't know why it is that dogs feel the need to go to the most inconvenient places to vomit.
Right. They rush for the rug, right? You've got a
Right?
whole house of floors and they're running for the rug.
Right. This cleans up off of a wooden floor really quite easily. You hit the throw rug every time. Or you chose to jump up on the bed.
Yeah.
Really, because now, do you know how hard it is to do the whole bed cover in the washing machine?
Right, right.
It's there's so many questions like that where you go, okay, you talk to any dog owner and you start talking vomit experiences, and they're all going to have stories of the dog going to the carpet or going to the bed. And then you don't know that, the analytical scientist in me says, okay, is it we only remember those? And it's only 10% of the time, and we forget the 90% because it was such a mess here. Or are our domesticated dogs really cueing in on something that makes them go here because it's, I don't know.
Like, most dogs prefer to leave the road and pee and poop in the grass or in the weeds. Maybe if there's just something about not doing it in the middle and they view the middle as the floor. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting question. I dare say, given how distasteful work would be, that probably wouldn't be my first line of research. But I wouldn't be surprised if there's a grad student somewhere. I'll check. Every conversation you get in with somebody, people raise questions that you just kind of go, I wonder if that's a thing. And I mean, the one of the big problems we have as humans is mammals, confirmation bias, right? The world is complex. We don't have time to do scientific studies on everything. You quickly start to see what you expect to see. You oversee what you expect to see. You undersee what you don't expect to see because you're seeing with your brain. Again, your artwork is a really good example of that. You're seeing with your brain, not with your eyes. So if I think red cars have crazy drivers, I remember when every time a red car cuts me off, I remember it, and I forget the blue, silver, green, black cars that do it because they don't spark that. So I just over remember what I expect to see. It makes life easier to go through, but it means that a lot of what we do with our dogs, we do because we see the result we expect to see. We often attribute the cause to the thing we think is the cause. And if you gave science millions and millions and millions of dollars in 20 years to study, we get our answers. And I'm not going to wait 20 years because my dog's not going to live 20 years and I need an answer today.
Yeah.
But just recognize, it's constant. Is that really a thing? Or is that just something we collectively in the dog community think is a thing?
Well, in a related manner, I'll see somebody with a big hairy issue with their dog in the trial ring, a dog that's, nipping and jumping and barking at the handler. And the person will usually say, my dog only does this at trials. And yet when you start digging in and really talking about what else you do with your dog, then all of a sudden they're like, oh yeah, I guess he does do that when herding. Oh yeah, he does that at home. And yeah, when I put the food bowl down. But in their minds, they're like, I have a trial issue. And I'm a big advocate of videotaping every training session. And because I know that I think I know what happened. And I look in the video, it's like, oh my gosh, I had no idea.
So you just hit on what I think is the most important thing. And a lot of my talks, I will tell people, whatever you think you're seeing, film it. Neither film nor tape exists. Record it. Sue Sternberg taught me this. She would say, here's what people are saying. She would then show the video. She shows the video slowed down, and you discover what you're seeing isn't what you thought you were seeing, or you're seeing it in other settings. And that's really, it's one of the best training tools is to have somebody recording you when you think it's all mundane. Because that's when you're going to notice, is this a trial issue? And therefore maybe there's noises, maybe there's a high pitched fan that my dog is hearing that I'm not hearing at this location. Maybe it's I carry myself differently in that situation, or maybe it's not unique to that situation. It shows up all the time and you just weren't paying attention.
Yeah. Well, in this course that I developed to help people see what's their dogs better, the first thing is this chapter called Explore, which is just to observe your dog in day-to-day life in your home.
Mhm.
And it's pretty surprising how people, I'm asking to look for things that are similar to your big, hairy performance problems. And they, inevitably, you do see the little things that you can work on at home, which are closer probably to the core issue than the, external behavior that ends up exploding at a trial where you can't work on it because your dog is, over aroused or you are distracted or stuff like that. But, I want to ask you one more thing that
You get to ask anything.
yeah, well, many more things. But so something that struck me is, I've known how long it takes for information to go from the eyes to the brain, but I only knew it in the wrong structure. So when you said it takes 1/10 of a second, that was something I thought, wow, that's a long time,
Mhm.
especially if we're trying to mark the behavior of, let's say, a second foot on a mark bucket. So I've always had this feeling that I know what my dog's going to do right before he does it. And so I actually have started marking that. And,
Right.
and you refer to this action potential. And
Mhm.
I thought, is that what I've been calling marking thinking? It's these little teeny things that first are imperceptible that I think your brain is picking up, but it's not conscious because it's never acknowledged that's important. But at some level, your instinct is going, my dog's about to break his start line stay. And by saying I give no reward markers that are truly neutral based on my dog's learning from them and not being bummed, but that I will go, whoops about that. And then I just see the dog shift. So I feel like in some ways I'm marking the thought to break versus waiting till the break happens.
So I'm going to do a really bad thing that scientists do. I'm going to go and clarify two terms.
Yep.
But your basic idea is you're exactly right. You have to be anticipating the actions and looking for markers that lead to the action that bothers you, because by the time the dog is doing the action, you're seeing it late, your reaction time is slow, and the further ahead you get. And what seems to set apart really effective dog trainers from really less effective dog trainers, I'm more the less effective there, is that ability to mark now, which means you had to see it coming. You used the word instinct, so that's the first one I'm going to go. Instinct means a genetically programmed behavior.
Oh,
This is
yeah.
a learned, something you learn through practice and practice and practice and practice. Some of the estimates are 10,000 hours to become an expert at something. So it's your expertise that you build up rather than instinct. You would, in common terms, we talk about it being an instinct, a gut feeling, but it's really that composite that your brain has put together because of practice, 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 and anticipating it. So you're spot on. The need to be marking earlier. Action potential is a very physiological process of how a nerve conducts a message. And it's just why there's a delay. My nerve from my finger to my spine and then up into my brain is not a piece of copper wire that moves the signal at the speed of light. It's a chemical reaction that is changing, built on ions. So you're building up a pH difference along the cell, and that's a chemical reaction that goes the length from here all along the neuron up to here. The movement of that chemical signal is the action potential. You can use the word for other things, but that's what I refer to as an action
Yeah,
potential.
I had not heard that term until I read it in your book, or not read that term. So what's faster, a clicker held in your hand or a word that comes out of your mouth?
Okay, so I watched one of the top behaviors get eaten alive for the answer to this one, and I'm going to tell you what his research said. And then all the folks who are clicker trainers, this was at APDT last year, and not the online one. So a year ago, October. And he had data to show that the voice marker was as fast or faster and as effective as the clicker, and he got eaten alive by the clicker trainer people. And to the best of my knowledge, his is the only set of studies that really looked at that direct question. And so I would say, well, based on his data, the speaking is faster. The only reason I would think biologically it'd be faster, it's a lot shorter trip from the brain to the mouth than it is the brain to the finger. And so you're going to get a slightly quicker reaction time. Is it a meaningful difference? That's the core. And that was what so much of the debate was about. And I don't know. My experience, and I'm not the best animal trainer, is that a voice marker works just as well as the clicker. But I know people who work with dolphins who tell me, oh God, no, clicker is it. And they hear the clicker and that becomes such a clear marker. So I'm going to dodge this one and say, I think the data are unconvincing, but I see a lot of trainers who are very effective with the voice. And I think you can be, my impression from the data, I think you can be just as effective with voice as with a clicker. And I guarantee you there are clicker trainer people out there who are ready to show me wrong. And I'm ready to be shown wrong. I do think we're splitting hairs there. I think both are really effective.
Well, I've had a couple of interesting experiences with clickers that, I used a button clicker for freestyle. And then I started training running context where I used the box clicker, and I didn't really realize I had started using the box clicker when training freestyle until I was in leading up to private lessons with Michelle Poulet, who's like this phenomenal, she's like top of the freestyle world. And I was saying to her, I'm like, a week or two ago, my dogs just started barking when doing these tricks. I did brace work with 2 terriers. And I said, I don't know what is causing this barking. And so we couldn't figure it out. And then at some point during the lesson, I went, it couldn't be the switch of the clicker, could it? And she's like, well, let's go see. And so we pulled out a button clicker, the barking stopped.
Fascinating.
And so the sharpness of either the box clicker, I think it was the sharpness of the sound elicited a different emotional reaction from my dogs, or it's the association with running context, but I don't think it was that because I was only training 1 dog running contacts.
Yeah,
So anyway.
I have no doubt that the tone differences of different clickers would matter a lot. Dogs' hearing is so good and so much better in the higher frequencies than ours is. And I don't even know what higher overtones come out of a clicker. I'm sure somebody has done the physics on that. But it sounds very plausible to me. And I would recommend you do exactly what you would do anyway. Phil, take a bunch of video and and see. But it sounds reasonable.
The other thing is, I've come to believe from my own experience, including with video, that dogs that have, grown to be the ones that self-selected to be social and to read human beings, which you write about in your book, are the ones that became the domesticated dogs, and that they read human emotion and intention or whatever, attention or whatever that second word was that you used, really well. And so my feeling is by removing the emotional component, that we're just giving the dog a black or white, a yes or a no, versus, and it appears to me, even on video, that my dogs understand all the shades of gray of that was amazing to, yeah, not too bad. They seem to get all that from me. And I can, kind of modulate our whole experience so that we can kind of stay in tune with, modulate up and down together versus, the yes or no, or the black or white.
And this is one of the things that I think it's really important in people's relationships with their dogs. Dogs were heavily selected to read humans, and your emotion matters. I don't know how many times I've watched people finish like an agility run, and they're not happy because, 10 seconds ago, their dog dropped a bar, so they didn't cue, and they come off unhappy, and the dog's looking at you going, wow, I thought that was a pretty good run. They're not going to know the bar per se 10, 15 seconds later. It's way too long to associate your unhappiness with that particular bar. And they're like, wow, you don't really like agility anymore. Now, I'm anthropomorphizing what layers they're doing, but clearly they're picking up on different emotions. And when you come out unhappy, your dog is not going to get as positive. It's not going to get as much dopamine hit in the brain as if you came off happy. And I'm a firm believer in no matter how the run went, the run's not the best time to be training your dog. Be happy so that you're in those competitions, your dog is always like, this is a good time. And then you're training to clear the bars at other points when you could very clearly mark, you drop the bar, we stop right now.
Right. Well, and with the truly neutral, no reward marker words, that I can mark something and keep going, and it's not a bummer, but I figure it can't hurt to actually mark it. And there's a whole thing about it's better not to use them. And then there's a study, and I actually went back and read the study. And the positive word was a clicker, unknown what type of clicker. The negative, or the neutral, the no reward marker, was a beep. Now, I personally have one dog that if something beeps, he runs downstairs and hides. So was that beep neutral for all of these dogs? Might that have like swayed this laboratory study that now all these people are saying it is better just to give your dog no information? And when I actually will watch in person when I'm teaching, and I'm thinking, this should be better based on the scientific study that says it's better to just wait. But I'm looking, going, they're staring at each other. And then the person starts giving unconscious reward or negative markers, like they'll give the devil face, or they'll lean forward. They'll be trying to help the dog get out of this, moment of nothing's happening. So, go ahead.
I would posit you probably can't ever be perfectly neutral in a way your dog couldn't read. But I want to make a comment about science, and this shows up whether we're talking the science with vaccines, the science with our dogs, the science with just about anything. Science as a way of knowing doesn't get definitive answers from one experiment. Any one experiment will be testing some variable against some control, but you could have used a different variable and another way of controlling. If I got 5 scientists together, I give them exactly the same problem, I get 5 different experiments designed. Science depends on repetition of the experiment. Which is why something like the efficacy of viruses, one study by one laboratory doesn't tell you any given vaccine's efficacy, because it matters what people was it given to, what time frame was it given, and how long did you do the study afterwards. So everybody keeps designing different studies. The problem, so to get to the answer of are you better off with a neutral marker, would take 10 experiments and a couple of years and conference debates, and we would get a definitive answer. Yeah. And that would never come in time for a typical person working with their dogs. I do a lot of work with Sue Sternberg, who does a lot of observations, and she did the foreword to the book, and this is one of the things she comments on was I came in and I was like, well, you can test that. It's just going to take you a long time. And we have a want for firm answers, and you can have firm answers or you can have quick answers. You can't get quick, firm answers. Right. One study, you raise a good question. Was it because the beep wasn't really neutral? Did they need to use something visual instead of auditory? I mean, there's all kinds of questions, and you put 10 experimenters on it. What I tell people is be careful with overinterpreting any one study. And then remember that studies work on average, and your dog and you are not average. The example I use a lot of times with my students is, I'm a middle-aged male. I'll use middle-aged. I got enough gray hair that plenty of people would argue with the middle age. But, in fact, I was just one of my workers. I was up at it, and he said, I just bought an old house. It was built in such and such a year. And I was like, Ozzy, that's the year I was born. I think you have a middle-aged house. And he went, or my boss isn't middle-aged. But let's just say, I come into a doctor's office and the doctor says, you're male, you're this many years old. On average, your cholesterol would be this and your blood pressure would be this. Here's your medicine. No, they still have to measure my cholesterol, my blood pressure, my pulse, because I differ from the next person, have a lifetime of differences. So even if on average, let's say for a minute, that study was right. On average, dogs did better with a neutral marker, but your dog didn't, then you should do with what your dog needs.
Right. And, this does bring up a thing that Sue Sternberg said years ago. She's the person that turned me into the crazy dog woman I am.
She does that to people.
Yeah. And I joke and saying, you kind of changed my art career. But as it turns out, this is a variation. I mean, it's the same process I'm going through here as I was with art, which is, ask questions that I find interesting and then look at it from as many angles as necessary to try to conclude, something that leads to the next question. But where was I going with this? Oh, so some of the things with that study also were that the dogs were working with a scientist, not their humans. And so it was devoid of any social connection. So a dog that has been always trained with a person that's, in using emotion just naturally, that dog's probably already going, this is a little weird, and tentative. So yeah, well, and what Sue also, she said something really interesting. She said, I hope I won't get in trouble for saying this. I think she still probably believes it. She goes, dog trainers are some of the least creative people she's ever met in general. They tend to tell me how to do it, and they just want to do it the way they've always done it. And my experience of watching people is yes, that's true. They each have a system that they follow, and they just do it, and they think, well, if it's not working, I need to do it better. And they'll sign up for class after class after class and keep doing more of the same thing, which is that saying about that's the sign of insanity, to keep repeating the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a conscious marketing part to it, right? I'm distinguished from the other trainers because I use the Tim Lewis method. And so there's part of that. Or this method worked for me and my dog, so clearly it'll work for you and your dog, and that's the one I keep training. And if your dog's not learning it, it's your fault or your dog's fault.
Right.
Not that my system wouldn't work with the combination of you and your dog. I 100% agree with you. I think over 10,000 years of domestication, or up to 40,000, right? The starting point's questionable, and we can go 20,000 and probably not piss off too many people. 20,000 years of domestication, there were a lot of dogs were domesticated multiple times. There's a lot of ways that we interact with them, and then we build relationships with them on top of it, and it complicates everything. So the Tim Lewis method of teaching you this particular thing probably only works with one of my dogs, or might work with several of my dogs because I practice it well. And you might try it, and if it works for you, great. But if it doesn't work, that doesn't mean you're the one at fault. It's just relationships are too complex for that. And dogs, when I was a student, I'm always a student, but back in the dark ages when I was an undergrad, we were told explicitly, humans, we're distinctive because we have this brain that thinks, and all other mammals are pretty much, just stimulus response, stimulus response, stimulus response, and trainable because they're all just stimulus response. And that never made a lot of sense to me, that there'd be such a big evolutionary gap between us and all other mammals. Once we started doing functional MRI work on mammalian brains, and we're discovering rats have really complex behaviors with fellow rats that they know versus ones they don't. That stranger familiarity matters to rats. Well, it matters to rats, it matters to dogs. Every complexity we see in these human relationships, I think we're finding in dogs as well. And a beep might work for you and it wouldn't work for me. I just, all of these methods, I just think we have to recognize that it's a lot more complex and frustrating. And one size answers don't work. And it is frustrating because if I have a problem with my dog, I want a clear answer and a clear fix.
Yeah. Well, and one of the motivations for me to have created this OCEAN, which is an acronym, and I'm only going to say the first two because these are the keys to everything, which is observe your dog, and connect with compassion really means connect with the dog in front of you as they are. So you have a plan, but also know that when you start your session, your dog doesn't have a plan per se, but your dog is bringing whatever they're bringing. And if you just try to do your plan, you're potentially in conflict and nothing's going to happen. But the observe your dog thing is, and this gets into this chapter in your book that I started because I'm so grateful that I started there, because it got me thinking about how I used to talk about art to be able to talk about this. Because before I was able to think in terms of the biology of vision and the person only seeing what their brain thinks is important to see, I felt like I was trying to sell people air. Like it was invisible. I'm like, you got to see it to believe it, but you can't see it yet. And you just got to trust that you're going to see it when you see it. But now, I have these techniques that really slow things down and very little's going on, and just allowing the person to begin to really watch their dog doing nothing, just standing with 2 front feet on a mark bucket, notice like an ear twitch to the back, to the, to the window. And when your dog does that, look in that direction, which I think is feedback to the dog. He's going, oh, I noticed something, and you notice that I noticed, which is a connection versus I noticed something and you're like, nothing.
Right.
And so I think by observing these subtle communications that our dogs are giving, the more we see, the more they know we see, and the more they will show us because they know they're being heard. And go ahead.
No, I would love to. All that seems, there's part of me that's like, yeah, it should be testable, but that all makes perfect sense. You don't for 20,000 years get selected for being a close observer of humans and then not recognize when the human's not paying any attention to you. And so often we limit our view of what the dog's view of the world is to our senses. And a common one is we don't hear the sound, the dog hears the sound. We therefore think the sound isn't relevant. And it could be the most relevant thing in the dog's world at that point. And we don't hear the same frequencies. And even in the same frequencies, your dog hears softer versions of them. So I think you're absolutely correct. The connecting to your dog and connecting to what your dog is experiencing. And I think it's important on two parts. Because we see with our brains, the more we connect to our dog, we're going to be seeing what's there. It's one of the reasons in my book I say, you should count the breaths your dog is taking periodically, and you should check your dog's pulse. I mean, part of that is, it's nice health information, but the other is it forces you to pay close attention to your dog and what your dog's experiencing. Oh, my dog's laying there. His heart rate's way up. Something else is going on. I should be aware of that. So I think you're right. I think that connection is hugely important. I think the more you connect as a team, the better. My herding instructor regularly tells me, stop working on what you want to work on and work on what the dog's ready to work on. And when I do that, both Cricket and I make great progress. And when I don't do that, Cricket doesn't learn and I look like a fool. So, and the sheep outsmart us both then. So I think it's an important lesson, and I think it fits that sensory world. I'm going to force you to circle back to your art here. One of the things that I'm just so fascinated by the spools of thread art that you did, because it takes an idea. We can take a sentence from the English language, take out all the vowels, and people can read it just fine. In fact, most people, you can do that in the middle of sentences, and most people don't even notice the vowels are missing, because the brain, you're not really seeing the letters, you're seeing the word, and the brain is just moving on to all the connections to the word. And you do this with your art. I see a face, and well, if there's a face, I've got to see all the parts of the eye, and yet that eye might have been one spool of thread. There is no rest of the eye, but my brain is putting it all there. And when you look closely at a pixelated picture, you think, well, there's no way that's what's there. But the reality is your eyes are just catching pixelated pictures, and your brain is coloring in so much of the world. If it's doing that for vision, don't you think it's doing that for hearing and smell and what you feel?
Yeah.
And this all circles back to your connection to the dog. I think it's really important that you connect with your dog and understand how your dog's taking in the world, and then understand the limits of how you're taking in that world.
Yeah, and it takes time and a commitment to learn how to make conscious what is subconscious. So all that raw data is coming in, all the little twitchy things we can see with our flicker rate, but the brain is going, well, that's irrelevant, never been important to me. But once, and this is what I tell people, once you notice your dog ear flicking back to you when you're hiking, you will notice it, because your brain will go, well, you care about that, that's important. And this is a really interesting thing that happened. I was hiking with a friend who has a real great connection with her two border collies. So, and I love when Dakota gets to be around other border collies. It gets, they act a certain way when they're together. Mm-hmm. And so we are hiking, and Dakota is doing his normal thing, which is telling me what's coming around the bend. So one posture means it's a bike, another one means it's a dog, and the other one means it's a person. And another one means there's wildlife, which initiates me calling him to me, because right. I don't want him to experience a mountain lion or a coyote. So after that hike, and her dogs weren't giving her any communication, I thought, well, why is he doing that? And her dogs aren't, because they're all connected. They're, great dogs. And I thought, well, maybe it's because search and rescue training I did when I lived in Colorado, which unfortunately, that's the one thing I miss about having moved to California is this search and rescue group, FERD, is 20, 30 years experience. And they really, taught me how to observe my dog like crazy. So here's why I think he's communicating at that level is he knows I care. So her dogs also know everything that's coming around the bend, and they're just keeping it to themselves versus when he does something, I say, good boy. So for the years I've been saying that, he goes, apparently she cares what's around the bend. And as a result, he's getting clearer and clearer with his communication about it. Go ahead.
No, I'm just gonna say, I see the same thing with our dogs in nose work, where when they're doing nose work and they have to signal, now I found the scent, and they signal it back to you, and it really builds that two-way communication. They get used to sending you a signal because you respond to it, as opposed to in a lot of the things we do with our dogs, we either don't pay attention to that signal, so we don't reward it, or it's just not there because they've never been trained that, hey, you ought to be passing on some information. I would not be the least bit surprised that it's because of your search and rescue training that you're getting lots of signals back, because that's what a search and rescue dog does, is signals when it's onto something.
Right. All dogs notice, and the search and rescue dogs have just been trained to tell us. That's it. Well, and so when it comes to agility, these dogs with the big, hairy performance problems, dogs are actually doing you a favor. They're letting you know when they're confused, versus these other dogs that show confusion in these most subtle ways that it's often missed. And that in that situation, a dog can just gradually slow down and lose his motivation to run. And 2 years later, the person goes, what happened to my fast dog? Now I have a moderate dog. When in fact, if they go back and they start, listening to the smallest visual cues their dog is giving them about, I have a question, instead of ignoring it, then the dog is just going to go, oh, we're in it together. I have a question. You stopped. You're going to help me answer it. And so this observe your dog is the foundation of everything. And it's just the hardest thing for people to understand. There's more to see than what they're seeing until they start seeing it. So, I just offered this mark training course through Clean Run, and I was hesitant to pull it out of Ocean. It's part of this. It's a way of learning to see your dog better and connect and all of that. And my concern was, I'm now giving an external behavior. You train your dog to put front feet on the mark bucket, and here's all the great training you can do. And I kept going back to, but the biggest thing you can do is use this slowing down and training a behavior that you don't care about. So you're not going to get all goal oriented going, I want to have the best, fastest mark ever so that, I can win the class. Marks don't exist in any sports. That it just helps people stay present and start over, like you were talking about in herding, to start wherever your dog is over and over and over, which is the progress. But that after that course, some people seem to get it and other people will go, I learned nothing from that. And I'm like, okay. So they're basically saying they think they see all there is to see and there's nothing else to see. And, it is, and I guess those dogs that have the big, hairy behavior or performance problems, what the gift they're giving us is the motivation to figure out what's going on. Because the dogs that are just, slightly slow, or they sniff, or they do these things that don't remove your qualifying run potential, then people just let it go on and on. But the dogs, like if your dog is doing something that's blowing your run, you're going to go, okay, let me fix this. And maybe after you've tried all the external training and doing more and more and more and more and more of the same, that you might hit the point where you go, okay, let me try something else. And that's where, Ocean came into play, that, trying to put this into a remote learning experience, with interaction and process and sharing. And I mean, it's once people are in it, that surprisingly to me, the transformations have been as huge with the people as they were with the dogs. I thought we're going to transform the life of dogs, and yet it's the people that are going, oh my God.
So I've been playing something with you. You are an extremely observant person. You watch my nonverbal cues when I'm ready to talk, and you're really good at just stopping and going, And I did nothing for the last like 20 seconds. And then I tried one of my nonverbal, and you immediately stop. One of the things I think people don't realize is this, you don't just need these skills with your dog. Learning to observe those subtle differences, people use this all the time. And you're obviously very careful about observations of things. People do the same thing. We clue each other in, and then people don't pay attention. And you certainly know people who go through their whole life going, well, I was in the same experience as you. That person, they didn't show they were upset. You go ask them, were you upset? Yeah, I was. And some people don't see it, and some people do. It works with humans, it works with dogs. You've got to be a good observer. And some people show it differently. Some people have different nonverbal cues. If you get good at this with your dog, you'll get better at it with people as well. And I don't know that you want to run around yourself selling the dog techniques as people techniques, but the reality is most of what I learn in dog training, God, I hate to admit this, works in the classroom. And what I learned to observe with dogs works on people. That core message of observing and connecting, it would help people with people too. But I think the relationship you're going to have with your dog is going to be so much better, because the more your dog knows you're paying attention, the more the dog's going to signal.
Yeah. And, I view it very much the same as like meditation. I picked that up 3 years ago when I was standing in a wide open space of the future of my life after divorce is complete and my move is complete. And I realized I'm no longer doing stuff, I'm living my life. And I thought, well, what do I want to put in this empty vessel? And the word meditation came to mind. I'm like, who said that? I can't meditate. I'm too hyper. I'm too. Mm-hmm. And I actually started meditating for 3 years. Most days I meditate, and that observing your dog brings you back to the present moment, and all of those conversations you're having with your head that keep you from progressing with the goals that you have, that get in the way of being present with what is and responding. And that's where everything keeps happening. So I'm not sure where I was going with that, other than to say that it is a form of meditation to be present with our dogs. And I think that's one of the aspects of it that's so addictive, is that when you connect with a dog, I mean, my heart, I just feel like, I don't know if it's where it's coming from, but I maybe get a little dopamine rush. I don't know. Something happens that I feel good. Or watching my dogs hiking and watching them observing the world through their senses, knowing they are having a different hike. And this brings up another thing. I want to ask you this. So if you do soft focus and your dog is trotting ahead of you, and you soft focus like you would on one of those 3D posters, where you then see something, that continuous motion falls apart and you just see flashes of legs. Is that due to the blind spot in the middle of our vision, or is it due to flicker rate?
Or is it due to the brain just not paying attention to other things anymore? I don't know. That's an interesting question. When you kind of, soft focus is much nicer than zoning out, which is how I would think of it. And you just get,
soft focus with an intention, soft focus on the rear legs moving.
So you're not just zoning out. You're talking about like we're just really staring. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. Certainly not the blind spot. You have a blind spot, and that's easy to show, and I have a little technique in the book, and it's really common, but your eye flickers enough that the blind spot never really stays on unless you force it to, right? Like you're looking at. But if you were staring at the back of your dog, that blind spot just gets painted over with what's around it anyway. That's not going to be responsible for what you're seeing, but you can overstimulate the cones with normally the eyes moving around enough. So these cones are showing red, and now I'm looking over here, and so it's the cones over there. But if I'm just always staring at the same thing, I oversaturate them, and I don't know if it has to do with that, or if it has to do with something the brain's doing with perception. It's a good question. I don't know.
Well, you got to try it. It's really wild because at first I thought it was just my little dog because her feet are moving so fast, but then I was able to do it with Dakota too. And I mean, it takes some effort and some time, but if they're just trotting in front of you on a 6-foot leash, you know.
I might wait till we have less ice on the road. We have, right now, we've got a lot of ice on the road. And if I'm not paying attention to the road, I'm going to break a leg.
Yes.
But actually, I could probably try if I can find a good straight snowy path so I don't have to pay attention to my walking.
Yes,
I'll try it.
It was interesting. It was very interesting.
I love watching Gaits. I mean, this is not where you were going, but once I started watching Gaits, and they're too fast for you to see. So you watch them and you just see this pattern of movement that's really cool. But then if you, the best feature on my phone is the slow-mo video. I took a slow motion of Cricket diving for her food yesterday. It's always stuff, but of walking, and you can see pacing walking versus diagonal walking and all the footfall and the amount of coordination that goes between when the front foot picks up right before the back foot goes down. All really cool stuff. It's not where you were headed, but it's just an aside of just watching how your dog walks, or even noticing when you're walking with your dog, does your dog walk? Its back end is going to be offset, either a little to the right or a little to the left. It keeps him from tripping. Well, does your dog walk butt right or butt left? Most people don't know. I never really looked. Watch everything your dog's doing, and you're going to see some really interesting things. Watch where the tail is when your dog starts doing this versus that. It's fun stuff.
Yeah, and gait, that was one of the notes I made. I did want to get to this, so we'll just go to it now. That I noticed something about Dakota, and I do tons of slow-mo video where if I send him around a tree that's like 150 feet away, he flies up, wraps a tree, comes back, and if I call him into heel position way in advance, 3 strides before he hits heel position, his tail whips up, and he's not collecting yet, really. He's probably shortening his stride a little bit, but that is the planning to stop. And so how that applies to agility is when your dog has a stopped dog walk, that plan is happening 3 strides ahead. It's happening after over the second apex. And Sharon Nelson pointed this out at a seminar once. She goes, watch every single dog, their body position over the second apex. Some had running contacts, some had stopped, all different breeds. And every single dog that was successful in whatever their criteria was, their rear legs did not extend beyond their butt over the second apex. And every dog that had the big extended legs did not perform their criteria, whether stopped or running. So ever since then, she primed my brain. Now, when I watch dogs go over that second apex, or even the apex of the A-frame, I know what's going to come next. And it gives you that opportunity, if you want to mark the mistake, it's when the dog is actually planning to do it or not planning to do it.
Yeah, and I would be careful with the word planning, which seems to, in our use, generally implies a consciousness.
Yeah.
You do the same thing. You approach a stairs, you change your gait so that you hit the stair not halfway through a stride. Yeah. You don't really plan that. You don't plan when you're walking. That's all happening at some level beyond your conscious planning, but it's happening in advance. And so absolutely the dog's foot position is going to be several strides ahead. You could go back several strides to see when they started to make their adjustments. I didn't know the particular one you're describing, but it sounds very reasonable that you would see that because they have to adjust earlier.
Yeah, and she was a judge for, agility judge for years and years and years. And I mean, she sees a lot in dogs and horses. But the other thing about gait that I found fascinating is I've been watching a lot of horse videos lately via this guy named Warwick Schiller, who is doing something very similar as I'm doing in Ocean, but he's doing with horses. So people were saying, you got to check him out. So I joined a subscription. I've just started watching these videos, and I was so enjoying watching the relaxation and the transitions from walking to trotting to cantering back to trotting. And it was just so beautiful to watch that then when Dakota and I, and Lil too, but she was on leash, I started asking for little, herding away to me's and come bys, like he learned that as a pup. So he's just doing these really beautiful canters and then transitioning to a trot. And I'm like, my breath was taken away by the beauty of motion. And prior to watching the horses, I would not have noticed the complete relaxation at the level I was able to see it because I'd been primed to notice that with these horses. And, you know, so it's this great example of there's an infinite number of things we can see about our dogs that we're not seeing. And because we haven't seen it, you know, that we haven't had a motivation. So it's so encouraging to me that this can be my passion, and it seems endless. Like I will never reach the pinnacle of it, which is when I move on to the next thing, when I feel like there's nowhere else to go, I don't keep repeating.
And there's a good brain mechanism for what you're describing. And you mentioned it earlier. Most of the time your brain says never mattered, never mattered, never mattered. And I don't pay attention. I mean, you have structures, the amygdala, which are looking for danger, danger, warning, warning. But you're constantly getting so many signals to your brain that you have to ignore. One I often use with my students is I'll say, how many of you are wearing shoes? Don't look down. How many of you are wearing shoes? You know, you can tell by feeling. I can feel now my shoes. I wasn't paying attention to that earlier. Those neurons were firing the whole time. I was just ignoring it. What makes a person expert at athletic activities, what makes a person expert at training is learning to observe the things that they normally were mundane and they ignored. And you're right, there's a million things you can choose to learn to watch for in gaits, in ear position, in nose, in overall, how's my dog carrying itself? What's the hair doing? Is it standing? Is it laying? Is it smooth, flat, or just loosely flat? Tail positions. It's endless and fascinating. And then you get a new dog and it's a little different.
Yeah. And I think that this is the realm that art and science tend to merge, and why so many people interested in science are also artists and vice versa. Da Vinci being, of course, the quintessential combiner of those two. So, you know, and more on gait, this is another thing that I hope it would be great if somebody pursued this as a scientific study because of what happened. And your dog Wish blew out a CCL, and seems to be a fairly common thing that happens with dogs, especially, you know, high drive border collies.
Right.
But over the summer, and even before that, I just started feeling like Dakota just didn't feel right. And I'd ask people, like, is my dog okay? And they're like, yeah, your dog's fine. And it just was like, I don't know what it is. And so whatever was happening had happened so gradually, I couldn't pinpoint it.
Right.
But I finally I just felt like he just wasn't oomphy. And I'd look at him, I'm like, no, mentally, emotionally, he's there. So it's not like he was under aroused or under interested. Mm-hmm. His brain was there, but something wasn't right. And so I finally slow-moed video with the iPhone 11 that has the most amazing. Is that what you have? It's like,
that's what I have. It has just changed my life.
I know. So I did slow-mo video of him running around a cone on either lead, on both one lead then the next. And I was in one, I have to go back one more second. So there was some little hitch in his giddy up, I'll say. Every now and then it's like, what was that? We'd be hiking, I'm like, or I'd be agility, I'm like, what? And what it turned out to be that I didn't see till slow-mo is sometimes on his right lead, so his left leg was on the outside, that when he was, you know, driving around a cone, that his left leg went into the position as though it hit the ground, but it was like hovering like an inch above. Now I couldn't see it in real time. And so then I thought, okay, we've got a problem here. And I started getting appointments with orthopedic vets. But on a side note, that once I saw it in slow-mo video, I was able to see it whenever it happens in real time, which kind of blows me away in terms of that being an example.
Do you know Chris Zink?
Yes.
Yeah, she's got some fabulous video of agility dogs showing these tiny hints of injury that we don't see unless you slow the video down and know what to look for. But it might be, you know, a dog that normally leads with its right leg, not leading with the right leg anymore, or how it positions it, or how it positions the foot. Absolutely amazing how those little subtle differences can signal problems, but also show up as differences in performance.
And are those available publicly?
I don't know. Chris has showed me a bunch of them, and I've seen them in her talks.
Okay.
I'll message her and get back to you later today.
Yeah, you know, because the other thing that became really interesting about this, that I think is where it would be a fascinating study for agility people, at least, is, I shared these slo-mo videos with orthopedic specialists, the top people in my area. And I think in hindsight, that led them to look for the result that this demonstrates, but only if it's seen in real time. Like I said, these are slo-mo, but they went, oh, if he's not putting his foot down, that means, minor tears in the CCL. They couldn't, and he had slight drawer movement, and, then like, oh my gosh, he had both knees. I thought, oh, bilateral TPLO, blah, blah, blah. But because of the delays of getting appointments with COVID, it turned out to be a great thing, because I put him on just leash walks for 5 weeks. And then the next appointment came, and the guy said, there's no drawer movement in the left leg, which was the problematic leg. And there's just a little bit in the right leg, which is the leg I didn't even know there was a problem. So now I'm going, okay, every vet said, if you have drawer movement, it never goes away. It is a tear, and it eventually leads to TPLO. And if you catch it before it's a rupture, it's actually a little bit better. But even if it is a rupture, they have a great outcome. 95% of dogs do extremely well. So blah, blah, blah. So then after that, I think, well, this doesn't make sense to me. So I go to one last vet. And by that point, 5 or 6 weeks later, neither stifle has any drawer movement. And so then I'm going, well, how is this possible? I've been told it's not possible. But here's what I think. This is pure speculation based on a non-medical person, that there are hundreds or thousands of agility dogs that are doing what Dakota's doing occasionally, which is the result of slight instability of the stifle. But those dogs don't go to orthopedic specialists, so that the orthopedic specialists are only seeing dogs that perhaps had this potential for tears due to the instability. They're only seeing the dogs after the tear, after it shows up in real time. So that the only thing they've ever seen is, the slight tear leads to, more. And so then I thought, well, wouldn't that be interesting to test dogs that, like, I can see what this lack of power from the rear looks like, because I recognize it in my own dog. And I do see it in other dogs where you just go, something is not powerful there. That if somebody did a study and just started testing all those dogs that did that thing, if they'd find that, yes, there is some instability, and that perhaps you put those dogs with PT and build up more muscle strength, that you avoid them going down their potential path to tears that lead to TPLO. So, but I do, going back to the first things, I think I set these vets up thinking TPLO because I showed them the slo-mo videos they've never seen. They thought their brain just went, oh, that's what's happening, versus that's not what's happening, until you see it in slo-mo.
Yeah, there's a real problem in any research project if your sample is poorly collected. Vets don't go out and sample. Your study was close. I would not just study the dogs that show a little bit of this. I would study the dogs that don't show it at all. You randomly pick 100 dogs and then you start taking your measurements, because some of the dogs that don't show it might have something that you just weren't noticing, or it's more complex than that. But if the classic example is a study that was done during World War II, looking at the bullet hole distribution on airplanes, of those that made it back. And those that made it back had lots of holes in the wings and the tail. And people started to conclude, oh, we need to put more armor in the wings and the tail, because the planes are getting shot up in those areas, and almost no bullet holes in the engines and almost no bullet holes in the cockpit. Those don't need any more armor. Well, the problem was, if they got a bullet in the engine or the cockpit, the plane never came back. And so their study was really biased. In medicine, this happens all the time. I only see the dogs that show up in my clinic, so they're already not a random sample of the group. And of those who make it to my clinic, I never see an improvement unless we do surgery. Doesn't mean that if a more astute person who saw something similar wasn't actually seeing a lower grade that would heal itself. I 100% agree with you. And it gets difficult to know mean, in a case like Wish, it was obvious what she had done. Her leg was dangling. There was no doubt what happened. It was, you heard the snap, you saw the leg, you're like, whoo, that's going to be painful. But for the millions of minor injuries that the body's remarkably good at healing, or that's not clinically significant, that's really hard to discern. And I'll see things on the web where people will say, well, I found 10 dogs with this condition and they really didn't need vet care, so you don't need vet care for this condition. Well, that's not correct either. That condition maybe needs vet care, maybe doesn't need vet care. Vets have to be careful not to say everything that gets in my door I got to treat. But thinking that you found a solution that worked here doesn't mean the vet's not relevant. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's just, it's really complex, and we have confirmation bias in what we see. I fixed this on my dog. Nobody needs to go to the vet. That always worries me.
Yeah.
But also not everything needs to go to the vet.
Yeah.
Some things actually heal on their own.
Right.
And there's no magic, do this, that's yours is going to be fine and yours is not.
Right. Yeah, no, it was like, it took me probably 3 days to get over the shock of that I'm not going down that path.
Yeah.
I was preparing my house and, prepare like the whole thing, getting ready to do recovery from that. And then just realizing, oh, I don't need a ramp on my back steps. And at least, for now, there's no drawer movement. So I'm just going to, build them up and stuff. So, there is this other thing that came from your book that, and it's related to why my dog's poop gets soft the longer we hike.
Uh-huh.
And I want to know why that is, but in the context of these injuries and arousal levels, like a lot of agility people like to get their dogs super revved up with toys. And I come from the school of Sharon Nelson, which basically is the dog can bring on their own drive if you train properly. And so I don't rev my dogs up. I mean, I may, if they're nervous about something, I may distract them with an energy matching kind of toy play. But I'm wondering what you think about, high arousal states and the potential for dogs to injure themselves because the pain receptors, are ignored or the pupils are dilated and the dogs aren't seeing as well or whatever.
So and we also have the dog poop question, which is my favorite. Let's go back to what we were talking about, different people's training styles. I think it's always risky to say, well, this person's, or my belief is arousal is good or arousal is bad, and my dogs don't need it, and therefore your dog doesn't need it. I think there are dogs that need to be aroused more, and there are dogs that don't. I would err on the don't until you found out you really needed it, because I think dogs self-arouse pretty easily for sports like that. But I don't know of any biological reason I would make a generalization for all dogs on whether getting them aroused before a trial is a good idea or a bad idea. Clearly, for any athlete, human, dog, horse, whatever, when you're in the midst of the competition, you're not going to feel much pain, and the pain is what protects you from injury. And this is how professional athletes get hurt. This is how, whether that athlete's a horse, a dog, a person, the more aroused they are, the more hyped up they are, the more adrenaline in their system, the less they're going to respond to pains. Does that mean they're more likely to be injured? Seems reasonable. I'll defer to Chris Zink on that. She's probably got data on it. It's logical, but be careful about logical, because lots of things turn out not to be what's logical, right? It's logical that heavier objects would fall faster than lighter objects, and in reality, they don't. They fall at the same rate. And people believe that for 1,000 years till somebody actually tested it, and then they went, oh, shoot, it's wrong. So logical is good, still got to be tested. It makes perfect sense that an aroused dog would not feel the pain that would protect it from injury from an unaroused dog, but I don't know that you're arousing it at the beginning would lead to more arousal by the second or third step of the run than a dog that's self-aroused by the second or third step of the run and was already in the pain. Who cares about pain? I mean, when Wish tore her CCL, we were playing, thankfully, my wife was the one playing Frisbee with her. If I broke Wish, I would be living on the streets today. But when she threw the Frisbee and Wish brought it back and she was dangling her leg, she was clearly in a lot of pain and she didn't care. It was all, I'm ready to play. So we know that masks pain, and that masking pain leads to injury. But if injury avoidance is your goal, don't ever do anything with your dog.
Yeah.
And your dog's gonna have a really dull life, but there'll never be an injury. None of that's related to why poop gets softer when you're going for a walk. Did you want to go down that path?
I do want to know, because I think it's not only me who wants to know this.
Yeah. So when the liquid chyme is in your small intestines, it moves from there to your large intestines. And the role of the large intestines is to take out moisture, water, so it can be reused, because when you get a really mid-abdominal vomiting coming out that's like soup, that's what that chyme is. It's like a soup going through your intestines. But what comes out the other end is not soupy unless there's a problem. And that's because of retention time in the large intestines. When a dog is exercising, there's more muscle motility. Things are just moving through faster. So they come out sooner. They haven't had as much retention time in the large intestines. So not as much water came out. Sled dogs classically do this, right? They get in the first 100 yards of a run after they've been stopped, they'll all defecate. And they're just getting it out of the way, but it means it had less retention time in the large intestines. And so some of it will be pretty soft.
Well, that's interesting. So I didn't expect that. I expected it to be something related to that stress, or something else was chemically happening.
Mm-hmm. Just less retention time.
Cool. That's a simple solution. But you have so many fascinating little bits in this book. Everybody should read this book. It is the easiest read of a book that gives you real facts in an enjoyable way of any book I've read. It really is fantastic. And so one of the things you wrote that I really couldn't wrap my head around is that an astronaut floating in space is actually falling 5 miles a second. Mm-hmm. And yet the brain adjusts to thinking that feeling like it's floating. Can you explain that in a way that maybe I could grasp? Because that's a crazy thing.
So if I could put you out somewhere, it doesn't have to be in space. You can be in the atmosphere and jump or whatever. If you are getting no signals that right now you are hurtling through space really fast. The planet is spinning, the planet is on an orbit around the sun is moving through the galaxy. I used to know the number, but your resting speed is, tens of thousands of miles a second. You are cooking along, but everything that's with you is cooking along too. So it's no big deal. That astronaut in space is falling at 5 miles per second, but so is the spaceship around him and the air that's around him, and it's all falling together. So it doesn't, to the one who's falling, you can't tell you're falling, just like you can't tell you're hurtling around on a planet. If you're in a car driving at 60 miles an hour and you hand something to a person next to you, that thing you are handing them is going 60 miles an hour. But relative to the person who's sitting next to you, it's all the same thing. The way what's so cool about an orbit is if this is the Earth, if I go really fast, I get an escape trajectory and I go away, right? I'm off to the moon or I'm off to Jupiter. If I go slow enough, I just fall and hit the Earth. Re-entry, the space shuttle comes down or a space capsule comes down. But if I fall just at the right speed, I never hit the Earth, and the gravity keeps pulling me around, and I'm just falling, and the gravity is pulling me inward, but my speed was giving me an outward vector, and they just cancel enough that I'm going around in a circle. So they're in free fall. People often say they're outside the reach of gravity. No, gravity actually has an infinite reach. It's infinitely small at infinite distances. But you have a gravitational effect on the moon. The moon has a gravitational effect on you. And an astronaut orbiting is well within that distance. They're not free of gravity. They're just all the gravitational forces are offsetting. What does it mean? I don't know. I think it's kind of cool. It doesn't change anything. If you found yourself in free fall, it wouldn't change anything for you.
I might throw up though.
Indeed, and that was one of the real problems with space travel is, even that back in the days of the Apollo and Gemini, it wasn't manly to admit you threw up in space, and so they often didn't report back to mission control that they were sick. Everybody in the capsule would just agree, you don't want to admit that because that would get you canceled from future flights. Well, now it turns out, well, everybody gets a little queasy and a certain percent will vomit from it. But eventually your body adapts because the body is so adaptable.
And so in space, I guess they'd have like a butterfly net where they can get the vomit out of the environment and put it in the garbage can, like a poop bag.
Yeah. Yeah. Or a little vacuum. The Apollo capsule I'm sure any of the space capsules you have a vacuum right outside. And all you got to do is open a little port and you got an instant vacuum cleaner and you can suck that stuff out.
Oh, gosh, I see great potential for dog hair. Well, so, is there anything that I didn't touch on? I mean, I could have gone so many different places. I had notes, pages and pages of notes, and I just let the conversation flow the way it did. Is there an area that you think we didn't cover that you think people would enjoy knowing about?
So what I would hope the book does, I want the book to do a couple of things. I want people to get interested in science because we haven't touched on chemistry at all, and the chemistry of feeding. I have a whole big section in there on feeding. And I have had people yell at me after talks, adamant that their belief in food is right or wrong. And I just go, show me your data. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying you don't have evidence for it. And that can be frustrating. I know it drives people crazy when I correct. I try to do it less than I want to, and I do it more than anybody wants me to. I'll correct and say, well, you could test that idea, or you might not have cause and effect together. But science is also fun, and I want people to read the book and say, oh, that's kind of interesting. Oh, that helps me understand my dog differently. My dog didn't perform well today at the agility trial. Well, was that because of the noise at the trial? Was it because of something I fed him yesterday? Is it because my relationship? There's a whole host of potentials. And we often go to the behavior one, ignoring some of the biology that's behind it. So that's all one, is that science is fun and science can teach you something about your dog. That's the premise of the book. If that works and people get it, and I'm getting lots of feedback that says it does, great. The other thing is to not forget that there are limits on organisms based on how they evolved, right? The dog is a mammal. Mammals are quadrupeds, 2 arms, 2 legs. Why doesn't my dog have 6 legs? Because no mammal has 6 legs. Why not? Because it didn't evolve that way. Why not? Because 6 seem not to be adaptive, but it works great in insects. And if it never evolved in mammals, they never had a chance to select for it. And natural selection, what happens out there in the wild, and human selection, which is our selecting for traits and trying to reproduce them, are limited by the strips of DNA that we have available. If you can get a mutation that does something, why don't dogs photosynthesize? Well, that requires a whole lot of mutations, and it requires chloroplasts to be embedded in this. That's so many evolutionary steps. It's just not going to happen. If you understand that there are limits, I think on one hand, it's fascinating because it says the basic mammal plan is pretty much the same. Your bones are the same as what your dog has. Yeah, it's got an extra set of ribs. Yeah, it's got more tailbones, but same 7 cervical vertebrae. It's got 13 instead of 12 thoracic vertebrae, but it's all the same basic building blocks. It's the same radius and ulna. It's the same carpals and metacarpals and phalanges. And to me, when we start to see this is all a common pattern, we stop making humans here and dogs here. We're really a lot more alike than we care to admit, including our emotions and our distractions. I started down this path. I don't know that I ever finished it. I was taught this distinct separation between all mammal brains. Their brains are probably more like ours rather than unlike ours. And you perform differently on a day when you're happy versus a day that you're unhappy. And you might be unhappy because you read the news. You might be unhappy because you got a chemical imbalance. You might be unhappy because of some food you ate. Whole host of things that are hard to decipher. And I watch people performing with their dogs in freestyle or agility or herding or fly ball or a host of different activities. And they focus on the immediate, you missed this cue, what the heck's wrong with you? And maybe the dog was thinking about how lousy dinner was yesterday, right? I don't know.
Yeah.
But their brains are complex. They're, and this one, no one's going to get from my book, because people who read my book are already of this mindset. And I can't get my book into the hands of people who don't get it. But they are intelligent beings that need activities in their life. And I dread when I go by and I see a dog that day after day is chained up in the backyard with no human interaction, nothing interesting to do. And I think my dogs are doing nose work and herding and agility and freestyle. Plus we're taking them for walks during the day and we interact with them and we talk to them and we work and we make, and on and on. And I think how rich that environment is and how psychotic it would make a dog to be neglected and ignored, just like it would us. And the more we realize how important that bond is and how similar we are, I think the better. Frankly, I like my bonds with my dogs better than I do with most people. And I think a lot of us would admit to that in closed quarters because they're more similar in many ways. So anyway, the love of the dog, the love of science, and the fact that science can help us understand our dogs better. That's the core message.
Yeah. And so where can people buy your book and learn more about you if they want to? I didn't actually go through the biology or your biography. I figured that they can get it in the book. You're a PhD in.
Yeah, so I'm a scientist by training. I'm a wildlife ecologist, and I think the credentials matter in the. I'm talking a lot about science, and I do science, and my brain has been steeped in science for 50 years. That kind of stuff matters, but it also the fact is that I have dogs and compete with dogs, and all my friends have dogs, and etc. Means that there's some interesting observations in here together. Where can you get the book? You can get it at Amazon, or you can get it at WWII. And if people contact me personally, I also sign books and send out signed ones. So there's contact information. If they contact WWII, which is on the back of the book, but most dog people know the publisher WWII. Yeah. If they don't, they can Google WWII as one word, and they'll get to the bookstore and they'll get to Amazon. And the book's available. I also am I'm early in the stages of setting up a website where I can give responses to common questions to make the book a little more interactive for me, because I love questions like what you're doing. I love it when people message me or I give a talk and they ask questions. I learn a lot from the questions. So I didn't give you a nice little soundbite on where to get this to edit in. You can get my book at WWII or Amazon.com. How was that?
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, and I'm trying to figure out, like, is Sue Sternberg the what's the guy, Kevin Bacon of the dog world, where
everybody's within? That's an interesting positive. I'm going to text her on this as soon as we get done. How many degrees of separation from Sue Sternberg are you?
It'd be a great thing to do on Facebook, where all the dog people are. I mean, if it wasn't for dog sports, I would not be on Facebook. But it would be really interesting. That'd be fun.
And one of the challenges Sue faces, and one of the challenges I imagine you face, is you say things that not everybody's going to agree with. It's one of the challenges of writing a book. I mentioned it at 5. There are 5 major places where I take on controversial topics that I know people will argue with me about. It's okay. You don't have to like me. Go look at the facts. Sue, you have some, here's what I see, here's what I've observed, here's what I conclude, and it means you should do X. And that always creates a certain amount of controversy, because sometimes people don't want to be told that, or they don't want to do the extra work. One of my, I have a dear friend named Leslie, who I mentioned in the book, one of the few people I mentioned by name. And I had a problem dog, Blizzard. And what I wanted to hear was, here's the fix for Blizzard. It was like, well, that's not it. you've got a dog who you're going to have to manage the situation. You're going to have to see the situation before it develops and manage it for your dog, or your dog is not going to have any kind of a life and probably can't have life. And that wasn't what I wanted to hear, but it changed everything with Blizzard. It changed everything in my relationship with the dogs. And that's, this all comes back to how many degrees separation from Sue Sternberg. There are people who want to have degrees because they don't want to hear what she has to say. There are people who probably don't want to hear what you have to say. And I look at your art. I keep coming back to that video that you have posted. A lot of people want to think that they're seeing with their eyes, and they see the world exactly as it is, and they see it in an objective way. And your art is a really good proof that that doesn't work that way. That no, your brain is heavily involved in everything you see. And not everybody's going to want to hear that. So it's interesting. Have you run into some friction from that?
Oh my gosh. Well, two things that I wanted to point out is that if the thread spools were pixels the same size and the work were on the wall and you were the same distance, you'd be able to see it in pixels when you couldn't in thread spools, because the thread spools trick your brain into focusing on, I know what that is, it's a thread spool, and it blocks the recognizable image. And once people have seen my work once, now their brain is primed to flip it upside down and look for it and try to figure it out, so you can only experience it for the first time yourself. And I'm the only person I know who has never experienced my art, because I knew what it was before I made the first piece, which is funny. Right. But here's the thing about some people, that there's two oddities. Most people say wow, so that is just some kind of like surprise word that comes out. But this, in an early show, the wife of a friend of mine, they come up to me and they go, I don't get it. She goes, I don't get it. I don't get it. And he's like, she doesn't get it. So I take her and we're looking at the work. I'm saying, okay, here's these abstract thread spools. And then this work had convex mirrors. I'm like, okay, and then there's these convex mirrors and you're seeing the thread spools. What don't you get? And she's like, I don't get it. And I'm like, well, what are you seeing in the mirrors? And she goes, I'm seeing the thread spools. I'm like,
wow.
Are you not seeing an image? And she went, oh, she goes, oh, I can't believe it. She was so set that there was nothing to see.
And it's like those three-dimensional images. Well, one of my favorite ones is the number of times you can do optical illusions where there's a shadow, like there'll be a line and a shadow above and below it, and a gray above and below that. These are the same color gray above and below, but because of the way the shading is, your brain sees the top one lighter, the bottom one darker. And then if you just cover up the middle part, you see they're the same. And you're like, no. And then you take away you step it back, and again, the grays look different. Even when you know what's wrong, that optical illusion can work. And then there are other optical illusions where it's like, oh, I see, there's that classic one where it's a woman's face to the side, or it's an old woman's face looking at you, and you switch back and forth. And the brain does it. It doesn't do a middle thing. It does one, then it does the other. I hadn't thought of it with the thread spools. And yeah, if your brain was like, all I'm seeing is thread spools, it would never put it together.
Yeah. And, with the Mona Lisa.
How common was that?
What?
How common was that for people seeing your art?
Very uncommon. But so the other thing that would happen with like the really small ones that have such low resolution, they'd be the size of a postage stamp, like the Mona Lisa, is, you look at the abstraction, there's nothing there clearly. And you look in the sphere and you see the Mona Lisa, and most people are like, whoa, they're excited, they're stimulated, and then they're trying to figure it out. They don't realize it's upside down because there's so little data there. And so you just see them going through this process of like, opening the big question of what is going on here. And that excites most people. But occasionally a person would have a very negative reaction to their own response of being tricked. And they would they'd be mad. And or they'd say, oh, these are just thread spools. I could have thought of this. It's like, but you didn't.
But you didn't.
So they see the end thing and they go, this is simple. And they think they could have thought it up because the end result was so simple. But the reality of it is, to get something that simple, it started hugely complicated and gradually whittling out everything that is not essential to get to simplicity. So I think those people are people who have never created something to realize that you are starting with infinite possibilities and you just keep pulling things away. It's like the Michelangelo chipping away everything that is not David. It's that kind of
Right.
mentality.
I love the ones where you had some that were flat and some that had the built-in the curvature, so that when you would see them in the sphere, they wouldn't look distorted, but they look distorted up. How often did people approach the art and have to do that?
You know, there was some of that, or some people would get way too close to the sphere and
Oh,
you
yeah.
can't see anything. And so, you know, some museums would put like footsteps back there, or, you know, through trial and error, they'd see other people seeing
Is
something.
it just a crystal sphere?
Yes.
So just I have a crystal ball on my desk because my job requires me to make predictions about the future. And I'm like, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
But I looked at it, looked like, yeah, you're just doing that because this inverts the picture.
Just
You know,
like the
just a
eye.
sphere, because it's just one lens, inverts it. Yeah, well, that's another thing that you point out in your video, it's actually, wasn't it like a news, a program about your art, and that the image, you know, what I see is right side up is actually upside down on my retina, and clearly the retina's, there's more processing going on, but the lens you talk about, it's a classic experiment where people are given glasses that invert the world, and after about a week flips right back right up, and then when you take those away, now the world's upside down. The brain adjusts that, and you got to wonder how much of what we see is that reality is really there versus what our brains are painting in.
Yeah, and there's a book that I read years and years ago. It's one of the few, I got rid of 90% of everything I own to start my new life. And I kept just my key books, and one of them is The Holographic Universe. I can't, last name starts with a T, but it talks about that the brain processing is creating this predictable, seemingly predictable reality that we can interact with. And you know, that can freak people out too about my work when they realize that their brain is projecting the Mona Lisa versus it's not there. I've had a few friends, and not in a negative way, go, I can't even think about that. I can't think about what that means. And I'm like, well, that's really cool to go,
Yeah,
okay, to make known a biological process that is unknown.
It freaks people out when I tell them that they're always living in the past.
Yes.
And so not only do you not get to see the world exactly as it is, but you're seeing it late. And your brain has to anticipate. The only way you can catch a ball or drive a car is your brain is really good at anticipating the future, or how can a dog catch a Frisbee? It has to calculate where that's gonna be and get its mouth around it before it even gets the sensory input that says it's there. Because it's you're living in the past, and the world out there isn't what you're seeing, isn't really what the world is.
Yeah. Well, and so I'm just curious. So when you watch a video and you go, God, I thought my timing was better than that. Is that delay the 1/10 a second delay, or is there also a little other delay that's happening between the
there's processing delay that happens, and training delay, right? So your body is really good at anticipating that 1/10 of a second lag because it's just so common, right? It's all the time. But you also, let's take what happens to a memory, right? I see a ball. If I'm trained, I'm a baseball player, and I'm trained and I'm trained and I'm trained. I just see a baseball, I catch the ball and I throw it, and I don't even think about it. But otherwise, I might see a ball, which makes me think about my childhood. Oh, I didn't have a father, and oh, that's kind of, and you get all this other processing before the brain goes, oh, stupid, go try and catch it. And by then the ball's already landed. So you get time delays based also on what other processing is going on in the brain. The more you train, the more you get rid of the extraneous stuff. But any of that, and for gosh sakes, a lot of that extraneous stuff is not happening at the conscious level. We think of ourselves, and I've had discussions with psychologists, and I don't have the right language for this, but I'm going to try. We think of ourselves as this thing that is experiencing the world, but that's probably a very small percentage of what the brain's doing. Some say 10% of what the brain's doing is at the conscious level. Everything else is going on at a level that you're not thinking about. The brain is still working with it. The way to think about it is you can drive a car and be thinking about all kinds of things and travel several miles and go, well, how did I get here? well, you didn't have to consciously drive. Your brain had to be involved. If your brain wasn't involved, you wouldn't have seen the curve and turn the car and all that, but it didn't require conscious thought. And we often have to move our skills from conscious thinking to whatever else that other thinking is, the majority of it. You do it through practice and concentration and training. So you can get delays built in because you're letting conscious thoughts seep in. You can get delays just because you're a physiological organism and I don't know if signals can get routed the wrong way, but they spend a little more time processing up here. But it also requires lots and lots of practice. You may just need more practice. There's lots of reasons.
Yeah, and so one of the reason that Ocean starts with observe your dog with nothing going on, but your dog standing there, is that all that other stuff that a person's thinking about, like handling the course, remembering the course, doing a front cross, and blah, 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 all that stuff keeps the observe your dog below the surface. And so the only way you can start training your brain to go, this is important, is to just do it solely until it's somewhat of a habit. And then through Ocean, that gradually building more and more little subtle activities for the human so that they can start integrating this new seeing into whatever sport or whatever activity they do with their dog. It's a process. It takes the time, like anything. So, but it is like selling air. And I accept that until if people aren't open-minded, then they're just going to go, I don't know what you're talking about. I see my dog. My dog is like, knocking that bar. It's like, yeah, but why'd your dog knock the bar? There's a lot of stuff you missed.
Right. So. And yeah, and it's hard. So I know as a student, it's hard for me. Sometimes I have to do the mistake so many times. I'm like, no, I still can't see what you're saying. And then eventually, oh yeah, well, that's what you meant. Why didn't you just say that? I did 10 times. But that's true as a teacher. I experienced that with my students. And one of the best things I ever did as a teacher was try to learn things that I didn't know, like when I took up herding or I tried to learn banjo. And you realize every word you said made sense and I have no clue what you meant. But then you do it often enough and you see it. It's persistence and practice.
Yeah. Well, I think we've reached a good ending point, but boy, if we had all the time in the world, I can hear Lil barking in the background. I would love to just hear you talk about herding from your perspective, because I did the herding instinct, did a little bit of stuff, and the guy goes, so what do you know about livestock? I'm like, nothing. He's like, because apparently it's, anyway, but I don't want to even open that up because, if you ever want to get together and talk about herding, I'd love to hear it.
I would love to. That would be fun.
Okay, cool. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time, and people are going to love this interview. And I think even more people are going to buy your book. And it is a great read. And my attention span for reading versus listening to audiobooks has been really low during COVID. I've just had to go to audiobooks, but I was able to go read and comprehend and stay tuned into the book. And I was reading it through the EPUB thing, which actually made it easier than a book for me, just because I could adjust the lighting just right. So it's easy to read. But it's a great read. And, I didn't even touch on all the topics that I wanted to touch on. So I hope people really do follow through and read it, because it's phenomenal.